Welcome to the Inventory Professional Podcast, brought to you by Inventory Base, providers of industry-leading property inspection software, accredited training, and on-demand property reports. Join us as we discuss the latest news, legislation, and all things property, hosted by our very own inventory expert, Sián Metcalf. With regular special guests, listen in to our open and honest discussions about the role of the inventory professional and how to navigate through this ever-changing, fast-paced industry.
Hi, welcome to the Inventory Professional. I'm Sián from Inventory Base Academy, and I'm joined by Melissa from MGN Inventories. Welcome, Melissa.
Hello.
Here we are again, having a bit of a chat. Hopefully it's going to be useful to everybody because it's going to be about complaints. I don't know about you, but I'm finding that there's more complaints coming through. And I don't necessarily mean with my own business. We get the odd one or two, but not that many. But I'm talking to a lot more clerks and people, and they're having a conversation about complaints and wondering what to do. So I thought it'd be a really good way of kind of giving some advice and tips by talking about, both our experiences in the industry and also how to actually manage complaints.
I think they are something that's becoming more common. Personally, I've got a bit of a theory that what's going on with that is that it is so hard to win adjudications nowadays with TDS, DPS, whatever schemes people are using, that I feel that it's almost went the other way, that people preempt being told you've lost an adjudication. And so maybe agents and landlords are looking at it in a slightly different way. I think that people, as a general rule, are realising just how important these reports are now, both, a brilliant inventory and checkout. But I think that once they start going through the process a few times, they look for the things that the schemes look for. And particularly landlords, if they've been bitten a couple of times, they will want us to be very sort of overzealous with things, in my opinion. And so I think that's what's rising, these complaints to agents and to ourselves.
Yeah, I know, I agree. I think the different schemes are certainly looking for more evidence and they're looking for more specifics. And certainly, I think people are taking, as you say, more interest in the reports. They're paying them more attention, which is great. That's exactly what we want them to be doing. Because otherwise, in a way, you kind of like feel like you're doing all these reports and no one's really taking any notice. And then you kind of think, well, what's the point? But as you rightly say, the point comes when it gets to checkout and there's problems. And then you haven't got the right reports or the right information, or there's things wrong. And then, unfortunately, then the first thing they do is they look at the inventory or the checkout, or look at the company that's done the report or the clerk, and kind of like levy the complaint against them. And it's not always necessarily the case that it's got anything to do with us. But unfortunately, we seem to be the kind of almost like the first port of call. It's kind of like that's where the blame kind of like sits, because it has to, doesn't it? It must do, because it can't be anybody else's fault.
No, exactly. And I think, funnily enough, I had an agent the other day, I'd popped in for keys, and they said to me, I just need to talk to you. You need to have a look at this DPS ruling because we lost on the checkout that you did. And I was like, oh, really? Why? What happened? And the actual wording was that there was not sufficient evidence in the inventory to disprove what the tenant was saying. And the tenant had said, it was all like that in the beginning. It's almost
how unusual.
Yes, I know. I've never heard that excuse before. But it is sort of awkward. And I think that comes with your relationship with your clients, to be able to educate them in that purpose, because they had truly read that and saw that they had not won an adjudication and thought it was a checkout. And it almost required me reading it back to them, saying it was the inventory couldn't disprove what the tenant was saying, not the checkout. The evidence was there in the checkout. Luckily, that was not one of our reports that had been taken from another clerk. But yes, like you touched on, if something goes wrong, we are that port of call. It's instantly sort of, what have we done? What can we improve on, really, rather than looking at what was actually being said, which was it was something else entirely.
And this is the thing that it kind of brings to mind as well, is yes, we're kind of almost like the first port of call, but equally we're not the first port of call when it comes to feedback. We're not the first people to be told effectively, like you have, like, thanks, not gone right, or it's been thrown out of the adjudication, or you haven't won the case, as some of them will put it. And often it's a case of, well, I didn't even know it was going to, and what were the issues? And in a way, you kind of think, well, if it's going to adjudication, then why not have a conversation with us, with the inventory professional first, to get your ducks in a row, to actually look at the reports and to find out what's obviously the issue with the tenant, or stroke the landlord, or stroke the agent, because it could be any of those that are not quite happy, or the things are not quite right, or there's missing information or whatever. But have us part and parcel of that conversation, so we can actually say, like you did, reread it back to them, because you're kind of like, it's done, isn't it? It's a done deal. That case has been lost, whereas you could have maybe helped if they'd actually told you that this was actually going to adjudication, and these are the reasons why. And what were your thoughts on that? Would you think that would have helped?
Yes, 100%, because we then had that conversation. I mean, a lot of my agents are aware that I came from a property management background.
Yes,
so,
that's right.
Often, if they are going to have to go to a dispute, they do sort of mention it in passing. Another time when I'll pop into the office and we'll have a little chat about it, and I'll sort of say recommendations. In this case, obviously, it didn't get to me before they got to that stage. But once we'd sort of went through that and said, oh, look, it was based on the inventory, I said to them, from my experience, what I used to do when the tenants would say that, and maybe that you didn't have the greatest supporting evidence in the beginning, is just to be absolutely sort of pedantic and over thorough with cross-referencing things. So I told them, I would say, this is the clause in the contract, that's the other clause, this is the email we sent about the issue during the tenancy, here was the interim inspection report. So don't just rely on your inventory and your checkout, but compile as much evidence as possible. Any communication that they've had from the tenants on the system, often these systems now are date and time stamped, and you can pull up notes from every time you've spoken to them, which again is invaluable to them. So just that little bit of guidance. I was talking to the person that prepared the adjudication, prepared the evidence for the adjudication, and that was something that had never sort of crossed her mind before, that actually those are all things that really could have helped. Whether it would have made a difference, it's hard to say, but in hindsight, it's worth a go.
Absolutely. And again, that kind of highlights the other issue, isn't it? Is the fact is that side of things, i.e. on the adjudication side, again, we're not privy to. Obviously, that's understandable, because it's meant to be a kind of like evidence on the table. The adjudicators there on their own, without any outside influence, making a decision based on the evidence. But like rightly what you just said is that if you were given the opportunity, you could have used your expertise as a previous property manager to advise the client, get that information in the right kind of order, get them thinking, as you just already done, so that they compile the right information, so that when that adjudicator sits down on that table with the door closed, phones off, going, okay, what's going on here now? Everything is in chronological order, everything's got its audit trail, everything is clear, concise, and therefore they can make a balanced decision. If they don't have that information, then they're not going to be able to decide on it, because they are not mind readers. They're not ever going to be in the property. They haven't spoken to the tenant, apart from obviously maybe what they've been given is evidence, etc. So of course, whatever's in front of them, that's what they rule on. So if it's not there, or it's not clear, it's not concise, you're going to lose.
Very much so. And I mean, again, reflecting back on my time in property management, we had to go on several courses with the dispute schemes, and they would tell us, what they were looking for. And it's really when they used to say, look, we're never going to see the property. We've no idea. If you give us a few pictures of a little scuff on a wall rather than an overview of the wall and the scuff on the wall, for reference in size and character. And they say it's all just random small pictures to them. They really need us to be as thorough as possible in describing it. And I think sometimes because we're doing it day in, day out, over and over, we might lose that kind of perspective, that you've got this person just seeing this. They don't know, is it an old Victorian property? Is it a new build property? That would help them in understanding the aging of it. So there are all these things that when you look at it from their point of view, if they're just presented with sort of these minimal pictures, then that's all they can decide on. And I know sort of the conversations that I've had with people, everyone kind of says, well, all the schemes, they find in favour of the tenants. And it is true, because the onus of proof is on the landlord / the agent, whoever's submitting. But again, when you think of it that way, it's not necessarily they want to find in favour of the tenant, but you have to be so overzealous and pedantic. And if, we're not providing that as a service to the agents from the off, then they will have an issue with it.
I couldn't agree with you more. It is exactly what it is. And it's not exactly rocket science. It's quite clear. It's quite easy to understand. But I think there's a lack of understanding when it comes to, talking to the clerk, looking at the evidence and building that evidence bundle. And that's what it's all about. And that's why we kind of get complaints. And sometimes not obviously at the end of the checkout when it goes to dispute, but often beforehand. And because often we don't get really spoken to or until something pops up or and someone complains, and then maybe they will have the conversation and all backwards and forwards, and all of a sudden then we'll get included. I think a lot of complaints, what we've got to look at is the different levels of complaint, or how I see it, and also then how do we then manage that process. So I don't know if you agree, Melissa. For me, low level complaints are things like, maybe some spelling checks or some errors, or maybe, the write up is same as anything. Sometimes you write something down and it looks perfectly okay to you, but when someone else reads it, go, actually, I have no idea what you're saying. That's not making any sense, So often there's low level complaints like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, again, we are only human. Yes. Things are not going to be perfect 100% of the time. You might have a bit of a typo. And whilst we do all recheck our reports before we send them, there is a lot of data in there. And so it is to be expected that now and again that will happen.
Yeah, it does. Because, like you said, we are human, and I think these why I look at them as low level complaints, because they are a few spelling errors or something's not quite clear, and the person's not read it. But it's great when they're in a way when it comes to, because then you go, oh no, I can see exactly what you're saying, or no, this is what I meant, and you can change that. So these aren't necessarily life-changing events or big impacts on your company. They're just little things. But I think half the reason we have them is a lot of inventory professionals aren't necessarily auditing their reports. I definitely advocate 10% dip test, but in the main, to be honest with you, I don't know about you, but I do it 100%.
Yes, I find it invaluable, really, because especially if they are things where other clerks may have done it for me on my behalf, it's very hard to have a feeling and understand, again, that property without fully auditing it. And I'm always worried that I'm then sending that on to someone else. And if they ask me a question, I don't necessarily want to have to say, hang on, let me just have a look and see what you mean. I want to know what they're talking about. So
I want the heads up.
Yes,
don't you?
Absolutely.
You want the heads up so that you're already aware. And also, if you're checking it and there's a blurred picture or there's a bit of writing that's not quite right, or I got one the other day, it said gobby instead of grubby. So immediately, those kind of things, if you pick those up, then you can change them straight away. I mean, you can either send them back to the clerk, or you can change them yourself if they're minor and you kind of, it's very clear what needs to be said. These kind of things can be easily dealt with. So to me, they're low level complaints. Your medium-sized complaints or your middle-level ones are more kind of like maybe there's not enough detail. You kind of like getting what the person is saying, what the clerk is saying, what is being described, but it's just not quite enough. Or equally, there's kind of like some missing pictures. So maybe the written word is there, maybe you're describing an issue, but the pictures aren't there. And then, of course, you're in subjective evidence as opposed to objective. So those can become problematic going forward because you've got the written word, but if you can't necessarily put that into context, that can become a bigger problem going forward. I mean, what other kind of medium-sized complaints would you say a lot of people come across?
Maybe a lack of detail in the description. It's very easy, again, for us to be complacent and know what we're talking about, but not necessarily sort of fully reference that, especially if it is a landlord looking at it and they really want you to say it down to the wire exactly what has happened. And also things like issues with missing meter readings. Sometimes meters are a law unto themselves anyway. Sometimes you've got a really old meter, sometimes you've got a new meter, there's a range of buttons you need to press and not all the readings have been obtained, especially now more important than ever is to have all of those readings. Will elicit a very emotive response if they're wrong, and I think we'll see more of that coming through.
Yeah, I mean, a prime example of that is recently, I had a conversation with an agent where the meter readings weren't of the right meter, but that was done like nearly 2 years ago. And my view was, well, okay, you've got not only a picture of the meter, you've got a serial number of the meter, you've got a location of the meter. So if it's the wrong one, then someone needs to tell us that so that we can then rectify. We can't. It's not always easy to know and understand which is the meters. You can only follow the trail of evidence, i.e. the pipe work going from the gas boiler to the meter, or the electricity meter, bearing in mind how many properties there are, whether it's in a communal cupboard or not. So there's a certain amount of detective work we have to do as clerks, but equally there is a limit to what we know and what we understand. And if we're not sure, then for me, if you've got that body of evidence, i.e. the picture, the details, the location, etc. And then the landlord reads that. Landlord should then say, oh, that's not my meter. Fine, no problem, landlord. Can you tell us which one it is? We can either pop back, or if you give us a picture, we can update the report and we can get it that way. If you wait for 2 years and then say, oh, it's a bit of a problem and I now want compensation for that. Well, first of all, why didn't you recognise it and all the other times that the reports were done and everything else? And exactly what is it you actually need compensation for? Where has been your material loss? And then that brings me on to like the high level complaints where you do have issues of missed evidence. You've got a lack of really detailed, proper descriptions for what I call the good, the bad, the ugly. Do you know the type of reports where everything is in good condition, clean, bad condition, poor standard, and it's all button pushed. Do you know what I mean? So it's all color coded and that's it. So of course you're going to get complaints there, because then, if a tenant comes back to you and says, well, there's all these issues and all I've got is the good, bad and the ugly, that isn't going to help anybody. And of course, like you quite rightly said, you're going to lose at adjudication, because the adjudicator's going, well, I've got nothing here to disprove what the tenant is saying, so I'm going with the tenant because it's done on balance of probability.
Exactly. And I find those reports in particular quite problematic with the good, fair, poor, because if they have started an inventory and they say sort of fair to poor, poor, but haven't really described, it might be everything else is fine, but one mark on the carpet means they judged it poor, which is difficult anyway to sort of make that judgment. Then if you come to do the checkout and there are a litany of other issues, you can't get worse than poor. So, the landlord might be like, well, look, all these other things have happened, but the scheme will say, well, it was poor to begin with. So, I can't then make that adjudication to win in your favour, even though other things might have happened. So those ones are problematic with that. I think that is a real issue. And a lot of those reports are pre-populated. So I see quite a few of those that come through that say no chips and marks, no scuffs, no this, no that, because it's just there and they haven't taken it out. But then they might say sort of scuffs to low level as well. And then that's very confusing to work on that as a checkout. But also, if it was to go to a scheme, they've said both. Said there's no marks and scuffs, and also there's marks and scuffs.
Yeah. So which one is it?
Exactly. It's difficult. Those are very hard.
Yeah, and of course, quite rightly, the adjudicator will go, well, it's not making any sense to me. I've not really seen any evidence. I've got a long list of everything is absolutely fine. And it's all, like you said, it's automated. It's all click, yeah, good condition, clean condition, no issues. But I'm not getting any other kind of information. But clearly what I'm seeing or what I'm being told and what the evidence, because we've got to remember tenants will provide evidence, landlord will provide evidence, agents will provide evidence. This is not marrying up. This is not giving me the right picture. So to me, relying on the good, poor, okay, good, bad and ugly, as I always call it, it's just not enough. And so we're getting to a stage where reports are being looked at, as we've previously said, and they are being taken notice of. And quite rightly, this is the tenant's money, and these so often, deposits are £2,000, £3,000, £4,000, £5,000 deposits. Of course, they want their money back. So of course, they're going to challenge it. And if our reports aren't, doing basically what they're meant to be doing, because we, and I use the word collective we in as regards to the industry, are relying on just literally clickbait words, i.e. good condition, bad condition, poor condition, and nothing else, then of course we're going to just continuously lose. I don't see how the adjudicators can really come to any other kind of decision.
No, and I think it makes their job very difficult with that. I always think if these words are being used, it really needs to be as an overview and then really go into the detail for why, and back that up with photographic evidence. I mean, I've always been a massive fan of photographs because one person's scuff is another person's large mark, and it's so subjective between people. And again, looking at the end user, the adjudicators, they see thousands of these, every week, every month, and it must be hard for them to differentiate as well. So at least if they've got the evidence there. And I mean, similarly, things like burn marks, not all burn marks are just burn marks. Sometimes you've got the linear ones, which are from hair straighteners, you've got your iron burn marks. You've got ones that are just a very surface burn mark. You've got ones all the way down to the underlay. And I think it's important to make those distinctions as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And funny enough, I was actually reading in a forum the other day where someone had damaged the carpet and through a burn mark. The rest of the carpet was absolutely fine, just one burn mark. So the landlord's going, well, I want a complete new carpet. And everyone's going, and there was like a kind of like quite a big divide between, well, actually, no, you can't do that because there's only one burn mark. But equally, other people were saying, well, yeah, but it's one burn mark. But then when it comes to the next tenant coming in, the next tenant will come in and will say, well, look, yeah, but there's a burn mark. That doesn't look very nice. And I'm not so sure about this property. Maybe it's not for me. And it can cause a problem. So someone was suggesting, well, get a repair done, whereas you can actually, especially if you keep offcuts of carpet, especially when it's brand new, newly laid, there's really good professionals out there that can actually take that bit of carpet, they can remove that burn, they can remove that area of damage, replace it with a bit from the offcut, and basically the carpet's new. And quite rightly, the adjudicator will be looking at this and go, right, okay, well, you want a new carpet. However, you're not justifying the reason for a new carpet. Yes, it's got a burn mark, but if you were to give me a quote to having it fixed and replaced, we could probably go down that road because that's fair and reasonable. There's no betterment. You're not trying to get more money out of the tenant because it's just a burn mark. And therefore, the more likely to win that. But again, a lot of this information doesn't go out there. A lot of people don't generally discuss it. And again, we don't get that feedback from the adjudicator, which doesn't help either. And I think this all kind of like, feeds that whole complaint kind of culture that we are starting to get over here in the UK. I mean, it's very big in the US, but over here in the UK, not so much, but we're starting to get that way. And I think a lot of it is because clerks maybe not necessarily, again, aware of it until it becomes a problem, and equally they don't necessarily know how to deal with it. So for me, when it comes to complaints, I think the first key thing is to take them seriously, not just kind of offbeat them, think, oh, someone's just having a whinge at me. Take them seriously, and don't ignore them either. I spoke to a few clerks that said, oh yeah, I've just not really dealt with it, or I've not paid attention to it, or I don't want to. And I think not responding, I think that just adds fuel to the fire.
100%. And I think we've got to think of it the way that we would respond to anything. If we were complaining and someone didn't get back to you, it just escalates things. It makes it 100 times worse. Again, from my training in the past, we used to have a silly little picture up, and it would say sort of do it like a plaster, like rip it off like a plaster, just do it. Because the more that you think about doing it and leave it and postpone it, and think about what you're going to say, all that time the other person's getting worked up, just go back to someone straight away. And a lot of times when people are complaining, they just want that time to vent, and they want to say their piece. And whether we agree with them initially or not, it's not really sort of the point, essentially. And I think it's difficult for us to take a step back because it's our own work. And we have we're human, we have that defense mechanism, but it's so important, like you say, just to listen to people, and also so you get the full story. I think it's quite tempting if someone's complaining to maybe want to interrupt them and again be defensive and say, oh no, but this, and no, it was this and that. If you just let them say the whole thing, obviously make clear that you're listening to them and you understand what they're saying, and then you can try and address each of the points that they've said, or, you know, similarly if they've emailed. But leaving things is the worst thing you can ever do. And again, I think we've got to remember that our ASAP is not the same as theirs. So if you say to someone, oh, I'll get back to you ASAP, we're thinking, right, so I've got to do this one more appointment, then I've got to write something up and I've got to call that person. And the person that is waiting for you to come back to them is thinking they're calling me back in 10 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. They're thinking that you're going to deal with it right now, not knowing that, like you said, you're out in a property with a 5-bedroom to do and God knows how many other things to juggle and whatever, and all of a sudden day's gone, they're still sat thinking I haven't heard anything, and all of a sudden, like you said, their temper or their emotional state is becoming increased, and it could be a worry for them. We often think about complaints as if someone's just having a bit of a whinge, but sometimes it can be the fact that this is a real big problem for them, that this is impacting on how they're going to manage the situation going forward. It could be with a vexatious tenant, it could be with a upset tenant that maybe has got some causality in there. Maybe that there is a real reason for them to be in that heightened emotional state. So of course then the longer we take to respond, the longer, as you said, it takes for for them to kind of like them feel not supported, feel that they're not being listened to, and all of a sudden that just ramps up and up and up, and then before long you've got a huge problem. You've got a mounting out of a molehill, as it were, which you didn't need to if you just, like you said, got back when you said. So rather than say ASAP, say when, say date, say afternoon, say morning, say within 7 days, and so on and so forth. That's what you should be doing. So give them a time period. And definitely, as you quite rightly said, put it in writing, because it's so much easier to then go, right, now I understand what you're saying. Because sometimes I find when we're having a general conversation, and I think this is true of any kind of conversation, sometimes you misinterpret it, you don't always get it right. So if you get them to write it down, so write it down in bullet point. What's the issue? Where's the problem? Can you send me, a copy of, or show me what it is that you mean? Then you can then sit back and go, right, I'm going to say, clear your desk, sit down, look at it, think objectively. And I think that really does make a huge difference.
And it does, because it stops us having that instant emotive response as well. And quite rightly, like you say, it allows us to fully understand the situation. Sometimes if someone is quite distressed, it could be a landlord and it's been their mother's property. And now, incidentally, they're the landlord, but obviously they've got a lot of emotions around the property. So they might not think of things quite the same way as an investment landlord would. It's very emotive for them, and they might start talking about it. And as we do naturally, go off on tangents, and it's quite hard for you to get your head around exactly, what each of the issues is, because as they'll be talking about one, they'll go off to another one. And so that sort of that time that allows us just to properly overview it. And sort of like I said, with timescales, again, with the ASAP, I think people appreciate it if you're being honest with them. If you respond and say, I've seen your concerns, these are the things that I need to do. I need to look at the report, I need to speak to the agent, I need to speak to the clerk, various things that you might need to look at to be able to respond properly, how long that will take, and when you'll come back to them. And even if in that case there is a delay for some reason, you can't get hold of your clerk, then update them. Again, the worst thing in the world is to promise something and then not go back to someone. So if you are having that delay, to go back to them and say, look, I said I was going to respond to you now, not quite found out everything because I'm waiting for this person to get back to me. They've been out on the road. I'll come back to you at this time. Again, just keep them updated with things, and so they feel validated. They understand that you are working on it. It's not just sort of went into the abyss somewhere and they'll never get a response. I think that helps the relationship, because ultimately you might not be going back and saying something that they want to hear and accepting blame, but at least they know that you've looked at it, you've been professional, you've been calm, and you've looked into all the details, rather than just an instant, oh no, that's not our fault, that can't be the case, sort of thing.
And that's a real key point, isn't it, about blame, accepting blame, because some people will go, oh, I don't want to lose a client, I'm worried, I'll just accept it, I'll deal with it, I'll pay it, whatever. you don't want to be doing that. You want to be taking that time to, like you said, sit back, look at the evidence, look at what's being said, and gather the information that you need. And quite often, especially as business owners, if you're a sole employed clerk, self-employed clerk, working just on your business, just you know what you said when you've done things and so on and so forth. But when it comes to working with other self-employed clerks as part of your business model, then, like you said, you've got to go and find these bits of information out. You've got to talk to the clerk, find out, okay, what was said, what happened, what did you do, what didn't you do, and then be able to understand it better. And I think that there's sometimes as a pressure just to accept the blame, because quite right, agents got to try and potentially save that relationship with that landlord, because maybe the tenant's really upset, so that goes up to the landlord then takes it out, the agent then takes it out, and that's not necessarily a case of anybody's right or wrong. It's just emotions, isn't it? It's just part and parcel of what we, everybody does, just because we're human. But I think sometimes we then feel, well, we've got to take the blame because we don't want to ruin the relationship with the agent, even if it's not our fault. And I think that can be very difficult to come back from, because then you're kind of setting a precedent, almost saying, well, yeah, I accept blame for that, even though it wasn't my fault. And the next time the client might then come back to you and say, well, it's your fault, or I need you just to deal with it. I need you just to, I don't know, give me the report free, or pay for this, pay for that. Well, hang on a minute, it's not my fault. So I think you need to take that, that first complaint very seriously, step back, gather the information, talk to whoever it is you need to, make sure it's all given to you in writing, and then respond in writing, because that way then it's very clear. And if they don't understand, or if they're not in agreement, then you've got evidence as to what was being said, when it was said, and then you can move on from there. And I think that then helps you build that time frame, doesn't it, that in regards to the response.
Yes, and I mean, it is, especially as a people pleaser, it's so difficult not to immediately say, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, it was me, I'll look into it. And,
but you can say sorry, though. You can say sorry. Look, you can always say, I'm sorry that you feel that way. I'm sorry that you feel that this has become a big issue for you. However, can we take this back? Let's look at it, and then let's work it out from there. So yeah, you can, I think you can do a little bit of both, but I think you're right. Saying I'm sorry and then just leaving it, then you've just kind of like just accepted responsibility, and that's, I think, the worst thing you can do. It doesn't mean you're not responsible, because sometimes we do make mistakes, but I think accepting the blame straight away and then finding out it's not to do with you, you can't then backtrack from that.
No, that's difficult, and people do tend to remember parts of things that happened. So you might then get the next time, oh, but do you remember you said you're sorry, that shouldn't have happened. And it might be that, like you rightly say, you found out afterwards it wasn't your issue. There was, some other component to it. But in their mind, they'll just remember that you said it was you. Sorry that you would do this. Or, worst case scenario is if you sort of said, you have that report for free, that kind of thing. Then it does set a worrying precedent, because that's difficult to get out of if you've started it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a case of taking each complaint on its merit, like you said, looking at it from is it a low level, is it medium, is it a high level, and then just making sure that you treat each one as if it was a high level, because I think that's professional. I think it helps you keep everything in order, makes you respond in time, makes you create an audit trail in regards to the evidence, so that you're getting all the right information, and then you can convey that information back to the client. And then, of course, then from their point of view, they feel like you've taken them seriously, and that, going forward, if there is any other issues, because at the end of the day, you cannot, hand on heart say that any of us have been through our career to the point where we are now without at least one complaint. So how you then deal with it going forward really helps set your precedents and sets your mechanisms for managing all those kind of issues, without, like you said, initially taking the blame and then shouldering responsibility when it wasn't necessarily down to you. But equally, if it is down to you, then you've got to deal with it. I think it's easy, like I think we were saying earlier on, wasn't it, about burying your head in the sand and just hoping it will go away, and someone won't ever contact you again. They'll just forget about it. But we know that doesn't happen.
Never happens.
Well, you can remember from your property management side, I'm sure you've probably got experiences in that.
Yes, I mean things are emotive, and they are, houses are a massive investment for anyone, whether it's an incidental landlord or whether it is an investment property. But similarly, complaints that we get from tenants, and we do see some of those come through. It's not always that you haven't put exactly what the landlord wants to see on, but you get complaints from tenants both on inventories and checkouts. And really, I think what helped from property management time was the majority of complaints were from tenants, from maintenance point of views. And things like that can be very difficult because, again, it can be quite emotive. I had an oven that stopped working on Christmas Eve. Everyone's family was coming round. There was no way she could cook. And realistically, there was nothing that we could do. No contractors were out and about. All the supplier stores were closed with parts. The next time I think they could go out was like the 27th. And she was obviously very distressed, as you would be. That has ruined Christmas. But there are ways of dealing with it. And it's not necessarily shifting the blame. But again, it's being calm. It's being professional. In that instance, going back and saying, we are very sorry, but this, isn't our fault. Here are all the factors that are against us at this point in time. It's 4:00 on Christmas Eve. Everything's closed. No one's out and about. These are the times it will be open. And in that instance, there was not even anything that we could provide. But similarly, it might be landlords and tenants having an argument between themselves. And I think that we, more as clerks, are getting dragged into those. You might want a landlord might want to be present on a checkout with the tenant there, and they are trying to sort of pit against each other and get us to say certain things. And so it's being sort of part of that relationship, but knowing that we are independent. And actually, it's difficult with our industry because we're not in a position where the customer is always right. That isn't always the case. We do have the industry knowledge, we have the experience. Some of us might have property management experience, some of us might have experience of schemes, and so our reasoning and working out is going to be different from their limited experience of whether it be renting for a few years or renting out their property. The things that we see day in, day out mean that we have a different view of things, and actually we have the experience to back that up. So it's not necessarily that they're always right and that we have to agree with that. But I think, again, if we're saying our reasoning and we're working out, like with the carpet scenario you mentioned, I personally know that the DPS themselves, obviously they class it as betterment, as do all the schemes, but they would only allow £30 for a rug for a burn mark. And that burn mark might be in a completely ridiculous place that you would put a rug. You just might not put a rug there. But that's the compensation that they would offer, because it is that mark on that entire carpet. And even if a carpet was brand new. And so I think our knowledge is invaluable. And if we're showing that that's how we're coming to those conclusions, people will argue, but I think it helps our case, certainly.
Oh, it definitely does. It definitely does. And this also helps with the whole complaint side of things, where sometimes that carpet issue could be the fact is we didn't pick that up. We didn't notice it, or there was maybe furniture that was over the burned or marked area, and the complaint is, well, we should have picked it up. Well, how could we? Because there's furniture there. But then that goes back down to your report. If you've got furniture in the property, or as we had the other day, and someone I was also speaking to about, tenants moved their furniture in, and you're having to do the report afterwards, then obviously there's limitations. So you should be saying this in your report. You should be saying, unable to inspect under the furniture, or unable to inspect fully because tenant items present, or landlord's items are present, especially when landlords are still moving out while they're trying to get you to do the report, which happens a lot. And then down the line, you get the complaint, well, there's a great big mark, or there's a great big burn, and you didn't pick it up. And I said, well, no, I didn't pick it up because there was a bit of furniture over it, and we don't move furniture because it was a 3-piece suite and there was no way I would be able to see underneath it. So a lot of the complaints we can actually kind of sort out early on by just being more descriptive, setting out the limitations of our report, and kind of telling the reader, which at the end of the day, all your reports should be aimed at the adjudicator, these are the or this is the situation, and these are the conditions, or were the conditions at the property. This is the report. These are the limitations, and this is what could and couldn't do. So you help ease those complaints. But obviously, the other issue we then got is if those complaints become then a issue because there's been a material loss to the landlord. So for argument's sake, you've missed that burn mark. It is a material loss because at the end of the day, now that bit of either carpet or furniture has got to be disposed of because it's so bad. The landlord, if they can't get money from the tenant's deposit, then the next person they're going to look at is us as the inventory clerks. And that is why it's important to have your professional indemnity and public liability insurance in place. So should you get a situation where the complaint is going to such a level where we are talking of effectively financial loss to the landlord, who's now trying to recoup that from you as the clerk, well, then you've then got to look at, okay, is that something I need to now pass on to my insurance, depending on what the issue is. So for me, I'd be looking at, you've left the property unlocked or unsecured, haven't told anybody. It could be the fact that the door couldn't be locked, but you then didn't tell anybody, you've left the property, and then someone's broken in, caused loads of damage, or squatted, or something along those lines, or that you've missed a broken window, or you've missed a damaged item, a big item, could be a cooker, or it could be damage to the carpet, to the walls, to the fabric. Or we've had it once where there was a complaint where there was a shower unit and all the glass had shattered. So they were looking for us to compensate them because the glass had shattered. But the good thing about it, from my point of view, and what my clerks do that I work with, say my clerks, and not my clerks, but the people that I work with, they took overview photographs, and they also took photographs of the item, and we could prove that date and timestamp, that item was absolutely fine. And whatever happened in between us being at the property and the damage to the unit was out of our control. It wasn't that way when we were there doing the report. And that's why your report has got to be so detailed, include all the photographs.
Yes, and the peace of mind that insurance brings as well. I mean, we should all be doing it. We should all have insurance. But, God forbid these big things happen. And they do. It could be on a checkout that a tenant had stood strategically in a certain place to block something.
Had that loads of times.
Yes, anything like that. And actually, if the landlord wants to claim, it's something that we again need to look at sort of in-house, as it were, and think about whether we need to take that extra step. But for your agents and for your clients to have insurance that properly covers these things shows that you are professional and you are willing to take these things seriously as well.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily a policy you can actually claim on. It's a bit like driving your car insurance. You don't need it until you need it.
Yes.
And so it makes sense to have that there just in case. And also because a lot of them come with legal phone lines, somewhere you can ring up and ask for advice and guidance, because sometimes there might be something that you don't necessarily know or don't understand, or you need some advice on. And a lot of these policies come with that, or at least they should do. And it comes with my insurance, my car insurance, comes with my policies for my business. And sometimes having that go-to really has paid dividends for clerks that I'm aware of, where they've got that advice and they'll be able to go back and be able to kind of set this out to the client and resolve that complaint. And I think that's the key thing, isn't it? You need to resolve that complaint. You can't leave it hanging in the ether. You've got to deal with it. But you've also got to deal with it professionally, but also make sure you cover all your bases. And part and parcel of that is obviously your report, but it's also how you respond.
Yes, and I mean, it is all sort of, that big circle of having insurance, dealing with things quickly and professionally. And it might be that you don't get complaints ever. If you're lucky, nothing's ever happened. Might be all of a sudden you have one really big one. But it's worthwhile us all just being aware of how we would deal with it, the processes that we've got in place to deal with it, and ultimately look at it as a worst case scenario for everything. And if it goes to that stage where costs need to be covered, that you've got that in place as well.
Yeah, I think the complaints policy is key, isn't it? So that you can literally refer to that, use that as a guide for you when dealing with complaints of any level, low, medium or high, so that you cover all the bases and you've got everything in place, and it helps you structure that, and it stops you getting emotional, and it means then those complaints are dealt with. Client feels like they've been listened to, and like you said earlier, it might not be the response that they want, but at least you've given them a reasoned, measured, professional response that they can then work on. Because if you're not to blame for this, then what you've got to set out is exactly why you're not to blame. That means then the client can then take that forward and have that conversation with the client of theirs, i.e. the landlord or the tenant, and then hopefully then be able to sort that out. Because it's easy to blame everybody, but then when you're faced with the evidence and faced with the reasoned argument, a lot of people, they go, yeah, okay, I can see what you're saying. Maybe not. Maybe this isn't anything to do with you. Maybe this is a subject of something else or some other influence or some other impact that's outside of your control. And then they can then deal with it. But they won't be able to do that unless you actually do something about it. And for me, I think you should learn from every single complaint. I think you should use that as a basis to see whether your processes are working, whether your reports are good enough, and whether you need to make adjustments to how you manage both the complaint and your service as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, it is important, not, like you say, not just to deal with it and be sort of, oh, phew, it's over. I've sent my response, we're done and dusted now. And it's something important to take forward if there have been things that have been misconstrued, or you're seeing actually are not very clear from an outsider's point of view looking at the reports. How do you change that so it doesn't become an issue in future?
Exactly. And this is my point. You've got to learn from it, because 9 times out of 10, there'll be elements of that complaint which will then maybe factor in other ones going forward. Because again, you will always get a complaint. Everybody gets one. I had one the other week. I was easily able to deal with it because I knew exactly what the issue was, because I'd done my 100% audit. I knew what was coming up. I had a robust defence. I was able to kind of basically prove nothing to do with us. You need to take that forward with the other person involved, and it was dealt with. But that's because I had a really good handle on what I'm doing, how it affects things, and I had the processes in place. And I think sometimes clerks, and especially when you're a sole provider and you're trying to set up and you're trying to do all these things, and as well as earn money and do all these reports, it's the last thing that's on your mind, isn't it? You're not thinking about the complaints process. You're not thinking about, what happens should someone say you've done something wrong or this is your fault.
No, that's it. It seems far down the line at that stage, doesn't it? So
exactly. So for me, I think, you've got to have those processes in place and learn from the complaint. So I always look at it, what learning points can I get? What have I learned from this process? What can I take forward? What can I put in place that I didn't have before? Or actually, it could be confirmation. You're doing it bloody right. You're actually hitting all the markers. You've got everything in place that you should have. And that's why you're able to go, no, this is the situation, nothing to do with me. This is what I've done, and that's what I should have done, and so on and so forth. And in a way, it's validating that you've got your processes right. So I think it can be quite a positive thing.
Yes, and actually that was a complaint that I had recently. I had a tenant contact me who was very upset, and had sort of a range of similar issues, but things like none of the lights were working in the property, and the radiators weren't heating up fully. And those things did really help with the fact that all of the reports actually said the lights were working, but there was photographic evidence of the lights working. You could see them on. And the radiators, I do put that they were not tested. And I explained why that was as well. Obviously we can turn the heating on, but whether they heat up in enough time while we're there, whether they heat up fully, it's just not practical to be testing in that kind of respect. So I could go back and I could address all of those things. And like you say, sometimes it's positive. I knew we'd done all the right things and that I could justify those things. And, a learning curve with that for me as well. One of the things that the tenant had mentioned is the cabinets were falling apart in the kitchen. And I was really struggling to understand, exactly what she meant. And it turns out that, I was saying the laminate finish was peeling, as it sometimes does, especially around ovens, it cracks and it comes apart. And that was they're falling apart. And that is a classic thing, misinterpretation from how we perceive things and what we know is happening. If a landlord had come back and said, you've missed, the cabinets are falling apart, we would think cabinets were falling apart.
literally hanging, doors hanging off,
exactly.
Cabinets coming apart.
And again, such a key thing to have the photographic evidence there, so that it can be positive as well. And if, for example, with the radiators, we didn't have not tested in there, then that's an absolute learning curve to put that in there to make sure that we're covered, that we're saying it's tested or not. And it's probably easy to skip over not taking a picture of the light on. But in this case, it really helped because obviously I could say, well, look, it was at this date, timestamp point in time, the light was working. Obviously, it's not now, which is an electrical issue. And sort of go back to these are the points that could help and to contact the agent. But, again, that was easily resolved in that all the points could be addressed. And felt quite good afterwards that actually nothing was missed. Because in the beginning, the person was very upset, which, you can imagine someone moves in and says, oh, look, how could you let someone live like this? I've got no heat. It was cold. Even though it's spring, it's still cold, apparently. And, the lights don't work and all of this. And actually that, that wasn't the case, or partly wasn't the case, when she'd moved in. So it is good for us to be able to reflect on that both ways.
Exactly. And I think sometimes we think of a complaint as actually a negative thing. And, don't get me wrong, there are elements of that. Yeah, I agree. I think complaints can be actually quite a positive thing. I mean, no one likes complaints, but I think it's how you approach them. I think if you take the stance of, okay, let's look at what the issue is. Let's hear what you have to say. Let me go away and look at it, and I'll come back to you with a response. And that will give you the time to kind of gather the information, calm down, especially if maybe you've had a rather fraught conversation with the client, with the landlord, with the tenant. Things got a bit heated. Be able to take that emotional element out of it, and then look at it, things dispassionately. Go, okay, what do I know? What do I need to prove? What can I give over as evidence? And what can we take from this? And I think that's the key thing, isn't it? Is, like I said, being able to turn it into a positive. Okay, what can I learn? What can I do better? What has now happened that I can actually then use to substantiate my stance, how I run my business, or can I make improvements and turn it into something that can be quite useful? And I've had a couple, over the years where I thought, yeah, actually, do you know what? You've got a point. That could have been done better, or could have dealt with that better. Let's change this. And I think if you change it and you don't make that same mistake again, then you're lessening the likelihood of complaints going forward. And it also helps build that relationship with that particular client as well.
Yes, and it helps us progress going forward. The times change constantly, and the things that the schemes are asking for and the limitations, and even now with the meters, a lot of them are smart meters, a lot of them are changing. We need to be constantly changing. We can't just keep our set sort of format that we might have used years ago. We need to always be reviewing, like, these are the legislations, these are the things that are going forward for agents with regards to fire doors and the things that we mentioned. And so again, with complaints, like you say, we absolutely need to be using it to keep progressing as we're going along. And hopefully, if we are keeping up to date with things anyway, it will help limit those type of complaints, because you're already proactively addressing things that might come up as an issue in future.
Absolutely. Yeah, couldn't agree more. I mean, at the end of the day, we go on, and I'm always banging on about this, and I know that you take the same view as I do a lot of people I speak to. We are professional service. So if we're professional service, we need to act like that. And that means then making sure we've got all these kind of process like complaints in place, so that when they happen, and they will, that we're able to deal with them effectively, and also hopefully get a better outcome, as if rather than if we were just to either ignore them or be very kind of laissez-faire about them, or just decide, actually, I'm not dealing with it and that's it. We can't have that. So if we want to be seen as professional service, we need to act as a professional. And I think in a way that kind of really does kind of mean then the tips from my point of view about dealing with complaints are going to be quite valid. And I think certainly, taken seriously, responding to them, not ignoring them. Equally, don't accept blame unless there is blame to be had, but not until you've actually explored everything, make sure everything is in place and that you've got the right evidence, and also you've had time to properly think and inwardly digest the information. As you said, set out timeframes for response and keep to them, and making sure you learn from every single complaint so that you can build on your knowledge base, and make sure that going forward, the client feels that you are the professional for them. So any other points that you'd like to raise? Any other tips that you'd like to give our listeners, Melissa?
I don't think so. I think we've been through, all of the important things, like you say, learning from it, all of those things. It's so important. And we are, we do have emotions, and it's best to take that step back from things, just be calm and be professional. And, often it's your reputation you're protecting as well. It could be the clients. It is important to take a step back and think of how we would want our complaints to be dealt with. You wouldn't want to be ignored if you were complaining about something. You would want someone to come back to you as soon as possible. And you'd want the reasoning as to why they'd come to that conclusion, particularly if it wasn't the thing that you wanted to hear. It's no good just kind of saying, actually, no, that wasn't our fault. You have to back that up, and then people are much more responsive to that type of response in itself than just sort of a flat feeling like they haven't been listened to, or that they're not being agreed with, essentially.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. So I'm hoping that has been useful for everybody to listen to. If you do have any other questions, feel free to contact me at Inventory Base. My email is sian@inventorybase.com. Be happy to answer any questions that you've got. Melissa, thank you. Great conversation as always.
Thank you. Until next time.
Until next time. Yes, great. Lovely. Well, thank you very much indeed for everyone listening. And we look forward to talking with you again next Inventory Professional Podcast. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Inventory Professional Podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, subscribe to our podcast now and share the love. This podcast was brought to you by Inventory Base, providers of industry-leading property inspection software, accredited training, and on-demand property reports.